Okay, a couple things real fast. I am recording this, so I put it on Teams in case any questions, but I will post this on YouTube as soon as everything's done. I don't know how I'm going to keep doing this now on from YouTube and Teams. If you look behind me, it's the Pont du Gard Roman aqueduct in southern France. Of course, what else would it be today? And so a little bit more about really up to the War of 1812 and a few facts from there. And trying to think of anything else I need. Oh, so don't forget, we do have a little bit of reading due. That is pretty much the rest of chapter 7. And we're also going to skip ahead a little bit to chapter 9, I believe it is, which is the first few pages, 393 to 400, which is called the Era of Good Feelings. And so I assume everyone can hear me. Okay, good. And so that'll be the end of this unit. Remember, we have an essay test on Friday. So everybody who's digital, DLI students, everybody who's A-Day, they must log in at the beginning of their period and have their cameras on. So that's how we'll proctor it. And you take the AP, or you have AP, you take the essay. And I've already dropped the questions. They're on your assignments. There are 3 questions, 3 very good choices, and you must answer one. You must have a brainstorm, outline, and thesis. You will turn that in, so take a picture, but you can type your essay. So it's going to be a 4 or 5 paragraph essay. A 4 paragraph essay is okay because I know we have time limitations, and I want to make sure everyone gets done in this time period. And I know you're already getting the information, and this will be so you will have an outline ready to go. You can start writing. I want good essays. I want people to feel good about it, but I will grade it as a test. You need, for each body paragraph, remember you're doing it like a short ID, and so have the explanation of what it is, give examples. I would like 2 examples per paragraph, and then show why it's important. And why it's important is related back to that why. Remember in a thesis statement, X because of Y. You put the topic as X, and then Y is how you're going to answer it. So you must relate that paragraph, show why it's important as it relates to your thesis, your position you take on that essay. Sorry, I just got a question. I did not get a question. Okay, so if there's any questions, please ask me. But don't forget, oh, someone put it on regular chat. And so I get a good question about the last question about what ways did Jefferson's philosophy define his presidency. Yes, I'm asking what he did as president. So in it, you must lay out, a way to look at that would be to lay out 2 or 3 examples of his philosophy and different examples, but show how his presidency would be defined by that, or he would make decisions as president based upon that. And there's a lot of really good examples from there. And so you do have to lay out his philosophy, lay out the time, and don't forget in that opening paragraph, you need 2 or 3 sentences of context. So if you answer about Jefferson, you can bring up, hey, the Constitution was just written. We had the Federalist era and John Quincy Adams and the Quasi-War and the disagreement between the Republicans and the Federalists. That's context. And don't forget, every body paragraph in there, you have to relate back to your thesis statement. That's why it's important. All right. Any other questions on that? And once again, I will have this computer on all day. I'm at home, but I'll be working and doing stuff. So if you have a question, just drop it in on chat, and I will go through the questions. Oh, tomorrow for B-Day, there'll be a quick little quiz. It'll probably be on Monday's notes, and I might even throw in a question on the essay, but just a 5-question little thing. And digital learners, I will post that for you. So I'm going to post an online quiz on an assignments For everybody who is in class, you do not need to take that. It's for those who are not in class. And I will try to post it, but just so you know, don't freak out. You've already taken the quiz if you were sitting in the class. Okay, so it looks like everything is now functioning. And so don't forget, on my webpage, and hopefully it's popped up now, you know, the Partridge Post, if you go there and have all this information here, you school email, Western Civs, but if you hit AP US History, I should make that a bigger font. We have monthly calendar, but you have that how to write a DBQ in a long essay. And if you hit that, hit it again, it gives you all the information I gave you yesterday, all this stuff. Don't worry so much about the essay grading key. That's for when I'm grading one by hand. But it looks like I'll probably be doing that on the computer. Need a drink. And got sample thesis statements. By the way, a couple of these links might be on there twice. When Google changed how they did their web pages, I had to make a copy, and it duplicated a few things. I'm looking at it, I have the sample thesis statements twice. Not a big deal, but I'll take it off sometime. But please check there. Don't forget, on this page, I have every unit. I have the chapters. I have packets. I have all kinds of stuff in here. And we were going to do an assignment. I was going to show a video, but it turns out I'm not going to be gone, and I'll work out. I'll figure out something. Maybe I'll give that as extra credit. But I'm going to try to get this essay on the this quarter's grade. We'll see. It takes a while. But if anybody has, or if a lot of people really want that extra credit, maybe I'll think about it. But I'll move on now. Let's go ahead then and get started with class. I will get rid of this screen. Yes, we have the cats fighting in the background. Okay, so first period, I did get through the Embargo Act. Third and fourth, I didn't quite get through it. And so first period students, hey, you get the opportunity to watch again and critique how others are learning this. Is the screen popped up? Sorry, I'm looking at mine. It's kind of weird. Is it working? Are you seeing the screen? Should the Embargo Act?
Yes.
Okay. Yes? All right. So the Embargo Act. Just a couple things really quick about the Embargo Act. So this is where, and I think I just period, Jefferson said he will no longer trade with anybody. They'll have to give up the continental system. They'll have to give up their, organizing where I'm standing, the Orders in Council, which was the British blockade. He'll trade with nobody, but there'll be licenses given. And these right here are the table full of licenses, and that's Jefferson giving them out to merchants who are trying to get a license to do some kind of limited trade. And what happened was this: almost immediately, Jefferson would only give this license to people who did not criticize the Embargo Act, aka Republicans. Known Federalists and anybody who criticized the Embargo Act, they would not get a license and they could not trade. And this would lead to potentially economic ruin. And why this is so important, in one way, is because Jefferson made his name in the Republican Party attacking the Federalists for the Alien and Sedition Act and banning the criticism of government. And here we have Jefferson doing the exact same thing. And because most of American trade was with Britain, this directly helped France. And that is why this cartoon has a little picture of Napoleon behind there. I'm getting a pointer. Here's Napoleon right here. And you shall be king hereafter. Implying now Jefferson wants to be a king, which is exactly what they criticized Washington and Adams for. Remember what I told you, everything cycles around. And one entity will say one thing when they're in power, and they'll say something else when they're out of power. Oh, and of course, there's a dog saying bow wow. So with that, Federalists would try to mask their criticism. Oh, and I should add, this was a disaster. The Embargo Act led to economic destruction. for much of the coastal cities. They couldn't trade. There's no real industry. They couldn't buy the new British textiles. And this was a dismal failure. But Federalists began to criticize it. And so the government began to employ giant snapping turtles that would roam the shores attacking anybody who wanted to try to trade with Britain. So you see this? They called them "Oh grab me's." "Oh grab me," or the American snapping turtle. And this says, it's hard to read, but it says superfine. It's whiskey. And they're trying to get it on board a British ship. But the "Oh grab me" got them. And didn't it, how it nicks them. Oh, this cursed "Oh grab me." Do you see it? So first period got this. Everyone else, "Oh grab me." You see going this way. It's embargo spelled backwards. Ha ha! There are actually very few massive snapping turtles like this, but it was a disaster. And Jefferson, who, even though he would claim over and over again he didn't want to be president, he kind of did want to be president again. That whole thing about 2 terms in Washington's precedent didn't really mean anything. The president can run again if they want. This would happen a number of times, and for various reasons they could not run. But Jefferson couldn't because of the disaster of the embargo. And so in 1808, his Secretary of State, father of the Constitution, James Madison, would run for president. And he would defeat Thomas Pinckney and win an overwhelming election, another victory for the Republicans. And this is the 3rd out of 4 presidents that are from Virginia. And his Secretary of State will be James Monroe from Virginia, the next president. And one of the first things Republicans did is they got rid of the embargo, aka decapitated the snapping turtle. That is one gruesome cartoon from 1808. But also something else. If you know anything about snapping turtles, they grab and they hold on. And if you cut the head off to try to get free, the jaws clench even tighter. And this means that the problem was not solved. And so Madison's administration, that's Dolly Madison right here. Madison's wife had great influence, very intelligent person, obviously had influence behind the scenes, which was very common for women at this period. We've talked about this, how women like Dolly or Abigail Adams said, don't forget the ladies when you write the Declaration of Independence. And ironically, women would have more rights, economic, and even a little bit more political rights in 1800 than they would 20 years later, the Industrial Revolution. But there's John Adams. I don't know why I did it that way. And she actually was a little bit taller than him, but that commercial war was still raging. And so they did a number of bills to try to still not go to war and maintain neutrality. That's a painting by David. Napoleon would use paintings for propaganda purposes, put his face everywhere. We'll get a name for this in the 20th century through today called the cult of personality. But there's Napoleon crossing the Alps and attacking Italy at the end of the 18th century, sorry. The first law passed was the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809. Non-intercourse means no trade. And what it meant was the United States will not trade with any belligerent. Any belligerent means anybody at war. That means Britain and France. Well, that was most of the trade by American merchants. So this act did nothing. It was a failure, and almost immediately they looked for a replacement. So they went to the second most popular, maybe I would say the most popular of all the Macon's bills, Macon's Bill number 2. And it's just named after him. It's another Non-Intercourse Act. And what it was is this. The United States, I thought I wrote that down. So you're going to have to write this down. This is one of the things I made this partially for being in class, but the Macon's Bill number 2 is this. The U.S. will trade. U.S. will trade with whomever respects our neutrality rights. You respect our neutrality rights, we'll trade. What that meant is whoever gets rid of for the British, Orders in Council, for the French, Continental System. Whoever gets rid of that first, we'll trade with. And this is a really risky bill, because if we trade with one of those 2 combatants, by inference, we're picking sides in a war. So if the British get rid of the Orders in Council, we trade with the British, or vice versa. Well, the new French foreign minister, Citizen Cadora, would send a letter to the American ambassador implying that the French are going to get rid of the continental system. It didn't say they would do it, it implied. And by the way, I'm just dealing with letters that are implied. I always got to be careful. Get it down in writing what they actually think. But they implied, the French implied they will go by Macon's Bill number 2 and get rid of the continental system. And what that meant is then that the United States will not trade with Britain. Now, Madison was not quite as pro-French as Jefferson, but he and his party were basically pro-French and did not trust the British. The British blockade was hurting more American shipping, so they thought, all right, we're in. And the United States banned trade with Britain by Macon's Bill number 2. And this is going into 1811. Oops. Once again, I jumped the gun. Going to 1811. Now, Britain was actually considering getting rid of the Orders in Council, and they were debating it because British trade was actually being hurt at a time where Napoleon's fortunes seemed to be at its highest. Part of the reason the U.S. accepted this is because Napoleon really did seem like they were on the edge of victory. They had conquered most of Europe. Russia had been subdued. Then, of course, France is going to invade Russia in 1812. That's another story. So while this is going on, in the Northwest, there was a series of wars going on. Don't forget the Northwest. That's Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin. Now, we've already mentioned the Battle of Fallen Timbers and the Treaty of Greenville. And this is a watercolor of the treaty, or the Battle of Fallen Timbers right there. It gave the U.S. much of Ohio, but this would trigger a whole series of unequal treaties where the United States began to sign treaty after treaty with, well, they just grab somebody from one of these tribes, usually feed them a bunch of whiskey or rum, and get them to sign away even more land. So the U.S. kept violating these treaties, get a new treaty, violating the treaties, and we're just stealing this land that was promised to American Indians. And the various tribes there had been divided. They got together with for a confederacy back. Remember the Confederacy, like Pontiac's Rebellion, then it broke apart. Another confederacy before the Battle of Fallen Timbers, but it broke apart. And so these treaties, if you look at this map right here, these are all massive hunks of land that piece by piece the United States was getting. The treaties that, by any real analysis, are not legitimate at all. And eventually, the tribes here began to realize we have no choice. Oops, just one second. But to unify in some way. Unify in some way to protect our tribes or protect our land. Just a second. All right. Sorry about that. Everybody still on? All right, good. And we're coming to arguably one of the most important battles in American history. And it's one of these battles that everybody talked about. They knew it had great effect for the first half century of the 19th century. The Civil War got in the way a little bit, but I think it's a relatively comical sounding name to English speakers, the Battle of Tippecanoe on November 7th, 1811. And you might be thinking, now wait a second, how do we jump from the commercial war and Cadora's letter and all that to the Battle of the Northwest? They all relate. Well, a Shawnee in what is now Indiana, Wisconsin area, very intelligent, charismatic leader by the name of Tecumseh. Tecumseh would begin to finally form, I guess it would turn out to be the last real confederacy, the real attempt of the Northwestern tribes to stop the United States. And even though the time might be out, you know, by the early 1800s, the overwhelming power of the United States and how small the tribes actually were was becoming, well, would be almost fatal. But Tecumseh realized this is the last effort. If we unify together, it's our only chance to fight the United States. And he presented a very pragmatic argument. Don't accept their trade goods. Don't be dependent upon their whiskey or their cloth or their weapons. Go back to some of the old ways. Go back to what we did before when we're self-sufficient so we can stand up and fight the United States. If we are disunified, there's no way we could win. Very pragmatic approach. But his brother was a religious leader, and this is the phonetically sounded name right here. Tenskwatawa, I can't pronounce it. Tenskwatawa. Sorry, English speakers had trouble with it. So in the tradition of English speakers, he would be called the prophet. That's what they call him in the United States. Tecumseh, very secular, and his brother, the prophet. And he gained credibility by saying, yes, Tecumseh is right. But we have essentially the gods behind us. We are in the right, and I will prove it. And in 1811 or 1810, he predicted that the sun would disappear. He said the sun will go away. And what happened? In the middle of day, bright sunny day, all of a sudden the sun got less, or it got darker and darker and then gone. And he said, but I will show that I have the voice of the gods, and I'll bring the sun back, and this will prove, in fact, give me credibility that we must join together and fight. How did he do it? He must have magical powers. And you have this combination then of people who would rally around the prophet because the prophet can literally get rid of the sun. And this very pragmatic argument of Tecumseh. You should probably guess that the prophet, probably is going to have even more. Hey, show us another one. How did he do it? Well, a few years earlier, a number of leaders of the various tribes in the Northwest were brought to Philadelphia. The United States had them come back basically to show off how scientifically advanced the United States. You know, look at all this stuff we have. Aren't we superior? Don't you want to be like us? Do you see the futility of resisting? You should join us. Which, of course, considering how we've talked about how racism was accelerating at this time, it's almost like a cruel trick. Well, he was given an almanac. And so when the prophet got back, he very carefully checked off the days and didn't tell anybody. And in this almanac, it showed when an eclipse was coming. Boom. So we tricked a few people. By the way, one more thing. Look how this watercolor is. This is closer to the way he was dressed. They loved getting uniforms. It was very common to get a few. This was a trade goods from the British. The British were still trading with them, and a very common trade good. But look how Tecumseh is drawn. This is from a painting about 40 years afterwards. And the reason I use this is because 40 years after, remember what I told you, they were still talking about Tippecanoe. Tecumseh's name had real meaning. He was somebody that the United States feared and respected. He was somebody that almost stopped the expansion of the United States. He's one that the U.S. saw was a threat to an American, or this new American nation. Who knows? Remember I told you how they were scared about that western part breaking away all the time? Tecumseh might lead to that. And so they respected him. So look how they drew him. They drew him in 40 years later with features that are much more European. And they did that as an example of racism. Remember we talked about how racism was developing as we know it in 200 years earlier. But pretty soon it was anybody who was not white was seen as inferior because whites must be superior. They have the rights, they have the freedom, they don't die as much of disease. It fit in with Bacon's rebellion thinking. So American Indians, they are not as white, therefore they do not deserve the land, they waste it. But if Tecumseh smart, he must be more white. And you will see this a lot where somebody who is not of European descent, they'll say, well, they must have some European descent because they're so smart. You see it with Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass, there was either it was he is really mostly white of European descent, or a white person's doing it for him. You see it time after time after time. That's how racism is, and that's how insidious this is. And it's not just, don't think in terms just of people who are white thinking, oh, wow, I must be smarter. What does this tell people who are not white? See, the only way you can succeed is if you have European blood. And even then, racism is insidious. So back to this. Oh, here's then what, sorry. This is a more contemporary watercolor of Tecumseh. I like it has the British uniform on. And as you can see, a totally different face. I mean, he looks like a Shawnee. So with that, Tecumseh by 1811 was gathering a pretty large confederacy. And so he knew he needed the powerful tribes of the Southwest, the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Cherokee, the Choctaw. That's what he needed. And so in 1811, he went south to go try to rally these tribes to join the Confederacy. And he warned his brother, don't do anything rash. I'm going south. And so in 1810, this is an example of his speech and his very pragmatic approach. Very pragmatic approach. Americans want to take our land. And to do it, they intend to kill us all. You killed many. They talked about the blankets here that brought smallpox. The reason there's a question mark there, that's not sure exactly, that's a direct quote. But killed many of them. And by 1882, the reason I put that down is the vast majority would have died by disease. But this picture is the execution of Shawnee by the United States. Well, Tecumseh went south. Sorry, I got a little bit out of the problem looking out the window. There was a fight of magpies outside. It distracted me. I shouldn't look out the window. So back to this. So while Tecumseh's down in the south, William Henry Harrison, the governor, and he's also the military leader of Indiana Territory. So he's appointed by the United States Congress. Harrison, the son of a very wealthy Virginian family, that was a member of the House of Burgesses. He's very wealthy. Well, he's here in Vincennes at a fort here. He knew this area here were the bulk of the Confederacy-controlled territory. Tecumseh's in the south. Here along Tippecanoe Creek is a town, a village made up of the most intense followers of the prophet, thus it's dubbed Prophet's Town. Now the problem the prophet had is, and why Tecumseh was worried, once you predict getting rid of the sun, I think you know what's going to happen. All your followers are going to say, more, more, more. Get rid of more stuff, more tricks, show us more. And that became a real problem because his almanac doesn't have another eclipse. He doesn't know what else to do. And he kept promising more things to these most intense followers. And that is why Tecumseh was afraid. And this area, it says here, not been ceded to U.S. Indians. Well, it technically was promised to them. It's complex the way they did it. It wasn't permanently ceded to the American point of view. But Harrison, with militia, some trained forces, our U.S. Army was very small, and cannon with grape shot. Remember I mentioned grape shot before? They marched north into this territory controlled by the Confederacy and planted themselves right across Tippecanoe Creek from Prophetstown. They knew that Tecumseh was down south. This was the golden time. And in the winter, everybody was pretty hunkered down. So they knew they had a chance to take them, well, to make an encampment, a fortified encampment very quickly. And as they're camped there for a couple days in early November, the young men were going to the prophet, begging him, pleading him, attack, attack, attack. We can do it. And the prophet had made these outlandish promises, things like, if you attack and you believe enough, you will be bulletproof. Their bullets will not attack. Our relatives will come back. They will, their weapons will not fire. He made all these promises. And finally, on the 7th, he said, attack. And in a series of just human wave attacks, this very stylized watercolor, and that's supposed to be the prophet right there. And the problem with it is, I think you can see it, it's November. They're covered up more. But along the creek, they made a fortified triangular position, dug in with cannon, and it was very hodgepodge attacks, human wave attacks, trying to just overwhelm the American forces, the US forces under Harrison. And the big advantage that Harrison's men had was they were dug in and they had cannon. And eventually they just overwhelmed the prophet's forces. It wasn't like a huge victory on the battlefield, but at the end of the day, the prophet's man ran away. They had to give up Prophetstown and flee. And this would be one of the most decisive victories in American history. William Henry Harrison would break apart the Confederacy completely. When they heard in the South that the Confederacy had lost this battle at Tippecanoe, the Southern tribes, who were already very reluctant, they didn't trust Tecumseh, no way they would join now. This battle would change forever the course of American history. A decisive American victory. And therefore, the Indian threat, the threat to the advancement of the United States was removed. No, never again, never again will there be a, sorry, I'm just, once again, the window caught me. Never again will the American Indians be able to form a confederacy and stop the United States. It's over. And I want you to make sure you got this. They will never be able to stop the United States. Every battle that American Indians will fight, usually be attacked, to try to hold on to their land, all the way through, including the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876 in Montana, one of the most famous battles in American history, all the way to basically the end by 1888, 1890. Everyone was part of a very tragic last stand. American Indians did not have supplies. They could not, they would not unify. They were fighting amongst themselves far too much, and they would be defeated. Now, you might be thinking, oh, wait a second, didn't you say in a guerrilla war, which is a little bit how the American Indians fought, all you need to do is survive? Yes, but you got to have supplies. And they did not have supplies. Nobody supplied them. And after this battle, citizens of the United States, they changed their attitude. It went from we are New Yorkers or Virginians to they very commonly started calling themselves Americans. You'll see this in cartoons before this as the Americas or Americans. But citizens of the US did not call themselves that. After this, they called themselves Americans. And this is a big change. We'll talk about this more later, but this is what it's called nationalism. Intense pride in your country. And all of a sudden, we went from being this kind of desperate group to we are Americans. And that meant that this is our continent. Nobody else calls themselves Americans who live in the Americas. Canadians don't, Argentinians don't, Brazilians don't, only citizens of the United States. And that attitude is, it's ours, we're special, we're the Americans. It's a pretty arrogant attitude, of course. If you go someplace in the Americas, the continent, and you walk in, I'm an American. You're not. It's a startling statement. But one more thing. Who was trading with Tecumseh? Who was trading for fur and maybe giving them weapons? The British. And many in the United States believed that the British were actually equipping and helping. The British were equipping and helping the tribes. And so here we have the British stopping American ships on the open sea. The United States is no longer training with them. The United States does not trust them. Just fought a Revolutionary War. They have not left those forts. And now they're inciting these tribes to fight against the United States. Now, this implies that the tribes had no reason on their own to fight against the United States. There's no reason. But we blame the British. And this, combined with the commercial war, would be the reasons why. Oh, here is a great cartoon, scenes along the frontier of the British paying Tecumseh's men to scalp Americans. There was an element of truth to this. Scalping, it probably was happening here, but also in Europe before Columbus arrived. But scalping Americans, and this really fit that the British should be held accountable. And this would be one of the reasons for our first major declared war in American history, the War of 1812. Remember, all the fights along the frontier, no declaration of war. Quasi-war, no declaration of war. Barbary pirates, no declaration of war. Well, we're going to jump ahead of the war hawks and get right to this. I'll come back to the war hawks, but we'll come back to that. So Madison would be pushed into war. Madison would be reluctantly pushed. There's a whole new wave of Southern and Western congressmen who want war called the War Hawks. But like I said, we'll come back to them. We will come back, I promise. Now, Madison did not want war, but you combine Tippecanoe with the Cadora letter and the British still stopping American ships, and the push within his own party was overwhelming. And he finally asked Congress for war. And on June 19th, 1812, Congress declared war. The House vote pretty overwhelmingly for the war, but look at the Senate vote. It was close, very close. A few votes differently, and war would not have been declared. By the way, that's a picture of Oliver Hazard Perry winning at Put-in Bay. These are the three stated reasons, for the most part, stated reasons that the United States would go to war. And I know I'm going to finish this last a little bit. Neutrality rights, security along the frontier, and Canada. And these are the three stated reasons. Neutrality rights, security along the frontier was Tecumseh and Canada. The U.S. wanted to annex Canada. Neutrality rights, that's Cadora letter. But the area most affected by trade was in the Northeast, and they were opposed to the war. These were the two biggest reasons, so circle them. Ironically, the Orders of Council, the British blockade, they repealed it a week before the U.S. declared war. But in 1812, how did they get the information? They couldn't pass it along. All right, so right there is where I want to quit. I'll come back to the War Hawks. I will pick up this on, what day is today? Tuesday or Thursday? And I'm going to post this on the YouTube. If there's no more questions, remember we have an essay test. Please look at the questions and ask any questions before then. All right, I am done. Sorry, I got a little bit distracted by magpies fighting. Goodbye.